You know, sometimes when I'm traveling, people come up to me and say, "Oh, you're from Boston. I love it there." Well, the truth is, I'm actually not. I'm from New York. When I met the guys in Aerosmith, they said we should go to New York. There's clubs, there's a lot of stuff happening down there. And I said, you know what? I think Boston is a little more rock and roll than everyone thinks.
2 members of the Rolling Stones rock group have been arrested after a run-in with a newspaper photographer at Green Airport in Warwick, Rhode Island. Police say Mick Jagger was one of the 2 Stones arrested, along with 3 others. Jagger was accused of interfering with a police officer during an arrest, and Keith Richard, the other Rolling Stone, was charged with assault on the newspaper man. All 5 of those taken into custody have been released.
So by this time, it's around 11 o'clock at night, and the show's not going to happen, and these kids are about to riot. So the mayor at the time, Kevin White, gets on stage, and he goes, "All right, bad news. Stones have been arrested. The show has been canceled." And he gives it a minute, and he looks out and he goes, "Just kidding. I sprung him out of jail." Now, for my money, I don't know if it gets any more fucking rock and roll than that. Close of the 60s, we decided to make it our home, and it was kind of getting a name for itself in rock. I mean, I'm not really talking about that Dirty Water song. Besides, the Standells are from LA, you know. Rock and roll was finally starting to make its way, pushing out that fake bullshit psychedelic stuff. God, remember Ultimate Spinach or Orpheus? Badass garage bands like The Lost and The Remains, who actually opened for the Beatles, were giving Boston a name in rock circles. It was time to pick up the guitars, knock the drums over, and kick some serious ass.
35 colleges, 150,000 college students here from all over the world, bringing in fresh ideas.
The city itself was this transient college thing, right? BU, BC, Emerson, all these colleges, people come in for 4 years, then they're out.
I mean, I can't imagine playing in a band back then and all those college women around there, I mean, you must have had a great time banging all of them, which you're not allowed to say anymore.
And that's unlike any other city because we have a lot of new energy coming in, new, young, talented energy, being receptive to what's going on and people wanting to express themselves, wanting to be creative, and they can find an audience here for it.
The whole thing about Boston was it was a music scene. It was people that loved music.
It's a scene, and that's, if you come and you show up, you're in.
Kind of created a little bit of a community, musical fans as well as performers.
You could be in regular rotation as a band, a local band. They could be playing you at lunchtime.
We wanted to change the fucking world, We really did. And it's absurd. We were in the basement in Brighton, Massachusetts, and nobody wants to listen to us.
It was a fucking scene, yeah. I mean, I have pictures of people playing out on the sidewalk in the Fenway.
There wasn't just like a New Orleans, swampy scene. There wasn't just a grunge scene, and never really had to be pointed out or acknowledged as having that big rush or that big rise, because it was always happening.
When you say Los Angeles, people, they think of Motley Crue. When you say Seattle, they think of Nirvana. When you say Boston, it isn't like a clear identity.
The diversity and the individuality is mind-blowing.
Got this intellectual, liberal, stronghold type of stereotype, but there's also the stereotypes that completely against that. It's like a tale of two cities.
Boston has this weird thing where there's all of these meathead lunatics like myself, and then there was all these amazing colleges where smart kids from around the world would go to.
I didn't feel like being a girl in a band was a strange thing. It was like, oh, there's lots of girls playing in bands here. And
the one thing that I wasn't used to yet was sports culture and how integrated the music and the Rat being right next to Fenway and everything getting out at the same time and the melee and unpleasantness sometimes of that.
And I mean, I'm sure there were altercations between the two, but to me it was just really funny to have the punks on one hand and the Red Sox fan on the other, really just sharing the same street.
There's some juices flowing here that make a certain kind of fertile place for bands to start and get really good and kind of know what's the right thing to play. It's hard to say.
I mean, Boston is a city where within 30 seconds there is a 90% chance you will be in a fist fight with somebody.
There just was this undeniable vibe that somebody was going to get suckered.
The first band I worked for, their first record was produced by David Robinson. He's telling a story that they just finished recording and they're, let's go get something to eat. They go out and they're walking down Newbury Street and a bunch of skinheads in the middle of the winter pick up snowballs and start pelting them with snowballs.
I named my band, the Bosstones, because of Boston, and I would have named them Boston, but Boston had already done that.
It's jarring when you first move here, but after a while, you get used to it, and you'd have it no other way.
Very tense, very blue collar. I was educated to become a secretary, in Catholic school.
When the band finished school out in Amherst, we came to Somerville. They still referred to people like us as quote-unquote Bonnies.
Listen, fucking Bonnies right now.
It's not overtly friendly like the Midwest. But once you become a Bostonian, you're a Bostonian, and you learn to love the city.
The first day I came into Boston to live here, I went into a bank to open a bank account at That's My Bank on Kenmore Square, and there in the bank was Rick Ocasek, doing business on a much higher level than I was, but it sort of was this omen. Yes, the Boston scene is ubiquitous. You see it everywhere.
Of course, Jay Giles was a big band.
Jay Giles, and you had Andy Pratt.
DMZ.
Del Fuegos.
Music, movies, girls, human sexual response.
By far, the biggest band in Boston was Human Sexual Response.
And I learned later, Human Sexual Response is a band, girls is a band, and movies is not a band.
The Inflictors.
The Dogmatics.
Lizzie Borden and the Axes.
Mission of Burma, right?
The Cave Dogs.
The Cars.
Private Lightning and the Nervous Eaters.
Well, there was Amy Mann of Till Tuesday, but she was in a band called Young Snakes.
Buffalo Tom Lemonheads, Juliana, throwing music, Pixie.
Burying Their Remains.
Fox Pass.
But there was a band called Tribe.
Turbines came later.
And La Peste.
La Peste, which is a legendary Boston band.
La Peste and Unnatural Acts.
The Lost.
Liars.
The Bags.
The Bags.
The Bags.
Letters to Cleo.
Heretics and O Positive.
Morphine.
Somebody and the Somebodies.
Gruffy the Cat and Titanic.
The Titanics.
I'm not talking Boston. I'm not talking Aerosmith.
And then Aerosmith.
Aerosmith and the Cars.
The Dream, later Extreme.
The Neighborhoods.
The International Submarine Band.
Willie Alexander and Willie Loco Alexander and the Boom Boom Band. Sorry, Willie Alexander and the Boom Boom Band.
There was something for almost every branch of what your idea of rock and roll would be all about.
It's the perfect breeding ground for amazing music when you have emotion, blue-collar work ethic, and a sense of humor. Sometimes you need that because you're going to be told you suck 1,000 times.
You have to kind of get good fast or you don't work,
And of course, one of the most famous shows was a show that happened here. The opening band was a band from Ireland that was known for one import single.
And the headliner was Beruga Bandit. And then U2 came out and, just blew them away. You could have been trampled. People were leaving, they just wanted to see U2. Guess you didn't have a really good Boston debut. Choose another opening act next time you play town.
But when they came back in February '81 to do 2 shows at the Paradise Inn, sold them both out, they give props to someone and the Somebodies in Mission to Burma.
Reach out to someone and the Somebodies. Reach out!
When I think about somebody who lives on the other side of the country, what do you think about Boston music? Now it's probably Dropkick Murphys because of all the friggin' movies that they're in. And anytime anything is associated with Boston, there's a bagpipe in it.
It's probably not unlike New York, where Times Square was a place where you got shot. Now it's like Disneyland. I'm assuming Boston is the same thing.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
This is a man's world. This is a man's world.
would be nothing, nothing without a woman.
50 years ago, Boston was completely on edge. And for a city which still to this day can't shake that racism tag, this one night may have helped shape one of the greatest rock cities ever. Violence had erupted in the South End, Roxbury, all over the city. 38-year-old Kevin White, the guy who got the Stones out of jail, was faced with his first true test. Was he going to cancel the show and anger African-American fans all around Boston? Or antagonize the law enforcement crowd by ignoring what people were asking for? With James Brown and Kevin White at a standstill, the voice of reason came from none other than 27-year-old City Councilor Tony Atkins. And I quote, "It's too late to cancel. The word won't get around in time. There'll be thousands of black teenagers around the garden, and if the gates are locked, they're going to be pissed off. MLK's death and the cop-out will get all mixed up. We'll have an even bigger riot than last night, and only this time, it'll be in the heart of the city." The solution he proposed was to broadcast Brown's concert on PBS for all to see, keeping the people in their homes and letting those who had tickets go to the show.
Mayor Kevin White, give him a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. He's a swinging cat.
So all I ask you tonight is this. So let us look at each other here in the gardens and back at home and pledge that no matter what any other community might do, we in Boston will honor Dr. King in peace.
Some of the deeper roots of rock and roll weren't just grown out of Boston, they could have been planted here as well. The Remains, The Lost, the International Submarine Band. Some of these bands you may have heard of or not, it doesn't matter. The seeds that were planted eventually grew into giant fucking redwoods of rock and roll. In 2007, Pace Magazine wrote an article about The Remains, their 1966 debut album, which received the following review from Mark Kemp in Pace Magazine. "If these guys broke and not the Stones, we might be calling them the world's greatest rock and roll band."
Peter Wolf told me this. They blew the Beatles off the stage.
You think you never heard them before? Give a closer look and listen next time you watch the classic comedy, Superbad. The Lost was fronted by none other than local and still to this day legend Willie Loco Alexander. He had joined the Stones and actually for a while played with the Velvet Underground, who, by the way, in case you didn't know, was pretty much a house band at the Boston Tea Party.
People, they see the Velvet Underground as a very unique and distinctively New York band. The Velvets played 43 times, and in that period, I don't even think they played New York more than once.
Boston was riddled with disciples of Lou Reed. One in particular was the babyface Jonathan Richman, whose band The Modern Lovers you may not know, but let's face it, it's worth taking notice when a guy like Joey Ramone says, "Nobody knew we were just ripping off The Modern Lovers," because unfortunately, nobody knew who they were.
1, 2, 3, 4. Run, 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 run up. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Now, if you're wondering what happened to Jonathan, just know he's one of the most well-respected songwriters in the history of rock and roll, and I think he ended up doing okay for himself.
I was only phoning you to get to Mary.
People think of the Modern Lovers having a long shelf life, which they do, but they didn't really have much success at the beginning, or really at any time. They are, in their own equivalent lane, the same in a way as the Velvet Underground. Never had much success, but were so pivotal in influencing other performers to take their music up a notch or several plateaus and really run with it and inspire people to be dedicated to their art and their craft.
There are many of us who have tried to get the state of Massachusetts to declare Roadrunner by the Modern Lovers the rock song, not the song, but the official rock song of Massachusetts.
As talented as he was, you know, the stories of the difficulties are pretty extensive too.
So that delay of that release really changed a lot of things in what the influence of music. So it was actually, by the time it got released, the rest of the world had finally caught up with Jonathan,
And just as seeds fall from trees and give birth to new life, two of the biggest bands in the history of rock came out of the Modern Lovers. Ironically enough, the Modern Lovers was a revolt against the Bosstown sound. It was a cheap way to try and catch the San Francisco wave of people like Joplin and Jefferson Airplane. But it was such a terrible idea and fell flat on its paisley painted face.
It was an artificially concocted marketing scheme by MGM Records and said, all right, we're going to create this Bosstown sound because that was meant to be kind of a response to the very loose San Francisco sound.
Like, and then no one would touch any of the Boston bands at all. Jay Giles and Freddie Blue, who was the manager, he couldn't even tell people that Giles was from Boston because Boston was so tainted because of the Bosstown sound.
I knew Aerosmith, the Cars in Boston were from Boston. I didn't know Jay Giles were from Boston.
Down to it. I said, are you gonna get it crazy? I get down to it. I said, you're gonna move, get it all down, get it all night, get it all right, get it out of sight, and get it down, baby. Yeah. Whamma jamma, let me hear you, dig it.
And I was just warming up my boots at the rehearsal spaces in Aerosmith, playing for beer money. 3 graduates from Worcester Polytech started a blues band. Richard Magic Dick Salwitz, bassist Danny Klein, and the underrated Jay Giles on guitar. Joined by the shaded and fast-talking, sometimes BCN DJ Peter Wolf, whose own band, The Hallucinations, had just broken up. They became known around town for a greatest bar band ever with their intense live shows that they actually captured on the 72 classic Full House.
Jay Giles' band was my first, what were the Boss Tones sort of based on. You'd have to say, put Jay Giles in there because it was a big band, which I loved.
Okay, we no longer have to apologize for the Bosstown sound that the rest of the country is laughing at us for.
I would say they were the top American rock band, not just the best live band. Well, Aerosmith, you get an argument for them.
And then they played Severian Brothers High School in my freshman year, and that was incredible. And that was the first concert I ever really went to.
I think the Giles band was seen as legitimate and a kind of salvation of Boston and its music.
The Giles live was just unreal.
Just through their raw, sheer stage presence and energy, they became real fan favorites.
They did 3 sold-out nights at Boston Garden, before they broke up. Now that's a lot. Peter Wolf, just so theatrical, and they had the harmonica, Magic Dick, phenomenal harmonica player. And they had Jay Giles on guitar, unheralded, kind of underrated. But Duane Allman called him his favorite guitar player at one point. And then they had Centerfold, Freeze Frame, they had some hits there, and Love Stinks, which later Adam Sandler sang it in that movie.
One thing's for sure. Love stinks? Love stinks!
That's one of the big untold, questions of Boston rock. What happened to these guys? They just put out an announcement, it was a divorce, blah, blah, blah. From what I can gather, Peter Wolf wanted to contribute, more of his own songs, and the band wanted Peter and Seth Justman to continue writing together. Peter was itching to do a solo record.
To this day, there's a mystery as to who asked who to not go forward with whatever the band was.
They couldn't reach an agreement, and the band put out their own album, without Peter, and it bombed.
I was getting even while you were getting odd. So make of that what you will.
It was a sad thing.
Well, there were, I'm not sure what the transitional moment was, where the Jay Giles band, which had been known as the Bad Boys from Boston.
I'm not surprised, and it sounds like something Peter would say, and it sounds like something Stephen might take.
You're listening to WBCN. Stick around, we'll tell you what your options are.
1 and 2 and a 1, 2, 3, 4.
I don't know what I can say about my own band. We were just fuck you against the world. People from Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, they welcomed us with open arms. We were blue collar, and that's where the name the Blue Army came from, because everybody wore denim. There was nothing that was going to stop us, and I think, well, you kind of know where that ended up.
They are a high-wire act that is death-defying, because with all the things that happened to them and all the things they consumed, all the mishaps that they had, those guys should not be walking the earth. And they, in fact, all are as the group, which is a very remarkable statement.
Now, in Maxanne on BCN, she clearly was the one that first started playing Aerosmith and convinced the powers to be at BCN to play Aerosmith.
They have had a certain wisdom in what they've done.
Aerosmith's Greatest Hits was the first record I bought that my mom didn't buy me, so it wasn't Mitch Miller or Lawrence Welk,
Their private life has been one of great curiosity as well. I think that out of all the four major Boston bands, it's like Aerosmith is the theater and the drama and kind of the two faces. They're the comedy and the tragedy.
Once you knew how far they fell and how disastrous their situation became, you really truly appreciate the remarkable nature of that comeback. I call it the greatest comeback in rock and roll history.
I think that they did get sober at the right time, and if they didn't, they would be another 70s, no disrespect to Foghat and Blue Oyster Cult or something, some bands like that. That's where they would be right now, even though they did have 3 or 4 huge hits in the 70s.
You still have the Who going out, but it's, 2 of the 4 members. And, it's like, I saw Ringo Starr the other night, and, it was nice that he had his all-stars. But the original 5 members of Aerosmith, that's a remarkable statement.
Whether it's the Run DMC thing, the Diane Warren song, or before that, Crying comes out at just the right time. It's like they have that horseshoe up their ass, and there's going to be probably 1 or 2 more horseshoes before they're done. It's just, that's the way it goes.
By the mid to late 70s, we had become a thing that was out of control and made way for other bands. Out in Watertown, a tinkering nerd from MIT came up with a band named Boston. Synonymous with arena rock, it was he and singer Brad Delp who created this sound, which would change adult-oriented rock forever. Why Boston? They say back in the day in Toledo, Ohio, when Schultz was a teenager, on a clear night, he would get those Boston stations. And proper Bostonians, ultimate spinach, that's the real reason I love rock, and the true reason why I picked the name Boston.
They never got cheesy, and they wrote solid hits that sounded great, and the vocals were layered and amazing.
When they got big, it's the first band debut in New York City at Madison Square Garden. And they debuted in Boston at Boston Garden.
They walked out from the crowd up on stage and started playing because no one knew what they looked like.
The legend has it that Tom Scholz lined his wastebasket with rejection letters from record companies. Apparently somebody who worked at ABC Records, the local offices, and Charlie McKenzie, who was working there, said, "I've got the band that we've been looking for." At the time, it was very original and unique. I think that Tom kind of credits the guitar sound to a British group, the Tornadoes, called Telstar.
All of a sudden, they just became, overnight sensations, and they had to play. They had to have a band because the label wasn't going to sign them until they came up with a band. So it's Barry Gaudreau, Fran Sheehan, and Sid Passion. The label signed them based on that. So those guys have been going around saying we were the original band of Boston, and Schultz has been saying no. I'm the original Boston. You just kind of hired guns.
I never saw any real tension when they were together, but if you had them together, Brad would always defer to Tom.
Were you as amazed as I was, and most people were, how the Boston music hung in there, especially on FM radio? Still, to this day, you can turn on the thing and there it is.
And it has to be more so for Tom, as he wrote most of the songs on all three albums.
The problem really was the singer, Brad Delp, committed suicide about 10 years ago. And Brad was the guy who, what a wonderful voice.
On one of their last tours when they were together, I said, I got to see this band live to see if it can hit those notes in person. And the dude hit every note. I mean, he was one of the more gifted, underrated singers of our generation.
It's sad to talk about Boston because of Brad Delp. And it's difficult to talk about Boston because you don't know 1/100th of what happens behind the scenes. And a lot of the guys that were involved, the players that were in the band, can't talk because of lawsuits. So I don't think we're ever going to know the real true story of what has happened.
Tom Schultz does apparently have some kind of chip on his shoulder. And I don't think he should, because he made a record that, what is it, 5 billion people loved?
To this day, other than I think it's neck and neck with Alanis Morissette's debut album as to which either Boston or Alanis sold the most of any debut album in history. And I think each is kind of closing in on 20 million copies.
I think if you asked people on the street, do you like the band Boston, I think the majority of them will say yes.
Schultz, unfortunately, has been involved in lawsuits with some of the band originally that played with him.
As sometimes happens, when you put people together, they work well until they don't work well. And that's kind of what happened with Boston.
The problem with Boston, the band, is that they defined a certain approach to music making. And even though they truly were a grassroots band, they truly did it on their own without a lot of outside help, because they did have this one brainiac guy who was able to do it, and they also had this one brilliant singer who could do all the voices that were necessary.
Boston put out 2 albums within 3 years in the late 70s, and then didn't put out another one until '86. And during that time, Tom Schultz was sued by CBS Records for failure to deliver another album.
But they did spawn a whole lot of sound-alike bands, and they spawned a lot of really boring music that was trying to sound like them. So in some ways, Boston got blamed for a lot of that stuff. Boston really did create AOR in a lot of ways, at least what that whole ultra-polished AOR sound was all about. Kind of predated punk rock happening.
But the punks, they were reacting against everything that Boston was.
It became fairly useless to me once I was like, oh my God, listen to what this Clash record sounds like.
I mean, it was a given that we were anti-corporate rock and anti-Bob Seger and Kansas and all this dreck that was dominating the radio airwaves at the time.
Punk rock started in Boston on a 10-watt radio station.
There's a gentleman here by the name of Oedipus who played Roxanne. And without him, we may never have gotten started.
As AM radio stopped being played, all of a sudden you become an explorer on the FM dial, and that's when we find college radio. So all of a sudden you'd hear Knock Me Down Again by The Outlets, so you'd hear Academy Fight Song by Mission of Burma, or Prettiest Girl by Neighborhoods, but that was when it started coming to focus that there was a coherent Boston music scene.
WBCN was getting its ass kicked by a kick-ass rock and roll station called WCOZ. They played the hits, they played Led Zeppelin, and they played the band Boston, and Leonard Skinner, and they played these bands back to back, and they played no new music. I wrote a memo to the staff saying, I'll play the fucking Grateful Dead if that's what it takes to break the Clash. And we did. And we beat COZ and put them out of business.
They played everything. They play Human Sexual Response and REO Speedwagon.
Disco, you know? I mean, BCN is always associated with a hard rock format or with just a good rock format, and very eclectic. But, you know, the range was incredible. There was nothing that wasn't fair game. You know, everything from spoken word to classical and everything in between.
They were fearless, especially Oedipus. He would add a band like at the drive-in and just be like, well, I don't care if nobody else likes it, I do. He was a pioneer, and he continued to be one until corporate radio just clamped down on all of that stuff.
We always had at least one Boston band in rotation, and I'm not talking the Cars, I'm not talking Boston, I'm not talking Aerosmith, I'm talking a local band.
WBCN played local music all the time in regular rotation.
And there's no other radio station in the country that A, had a local music director, or B, had an annual Battle of the Bands that featured local bands, not only for new music, but also for Boston music.
It's the real deal. The real kids, La Peste, Mission of Burma, Neighborhoods.
Those guys seem like the golden child of Boston. Like, they were going to be massive.
And I thought that band would go the whole way. I thought they were going to be huge.
So the Neighborhoods are headlining. Boys Life plays their set. They take their guitars off, they move their amps out of the way, and they jump off the stage. They're in the first row for the Neighborhoods. That's what all bands did. The Neighborhoods were the band to see.
Some people just have that thing, and David Minahan has that thing.
You know, my wife always says, you guys were racehorses, and you became donkeys.
The first time I saw him was the early 80s at the Living Room in Providence. I couldn't believe the floor was shaking. I thought the roof was going to cave in. I wasn't sure if it was what I was on or it was the band. But after about 30 minutes, I realized it was them. They were the real deal, and Minahan was a star. So much that David Bowie once said, "The Neighborhoods from Boston are my favorite band by far, no question."
They were still teenagers. They looked great. They were kind of glittery. Dave Minahan looked really good on stage.
They were the more commercial band, or most commercial band on Ace of Hearts, I think. The label that had the Neats and Burma and all that.
Just an incredible rock band. David Minahan was a great singer and a great guitar player. He could play a guitar better than most of the people in the scene.
Luck has a lot to do with all the Neighborhoods thing, and then extreme bad luck has a lot to do with the Neighborhoods thing.
Utterly absurd and kind of bubblegum, but or was it performance art? You couldn't tell. All I knew is that everybody in Mission of Burma thought it was the Cat's Meow. We loved the Hoods.
I think they could have been Green Day before Green Day. Oh, absolutely. They had so many great songs.
Your girlfriend think he's the living end. You're the prettiest girl.
Maneuver ourselves to be a pretty vicious live act pretty quickly. We win the Battle of the Bands, very first one in Boston, or at the Rat. From there, the momentum is building. We catch the ear of Rick Hart from Ace of Hearts Records, also home of the Liars and Mission of Burma.
We came to an agreement that I would make a 45 for them. We had a really smart cover, great sounding record, and the thing just took off. I know that it's the biggest selling single of its type ever from Boston.
Our record just started flying out of the shelves from there, and we were destined for greatness.
They had conquered the suburban circuit and kind of New England clubs everywhere because they were just so damn appealing. They were so awesome live?
You know, it happened pretty fast. It's that classic thing of like, wow, 18 months ago we were just, picking our noses in a rehearsal space, and now we're like zooming around. We had a truck full of production. We had roadies. I mean, we're kind of living high and mighty for teenagers,
I think they will admit that in terms of putting more records out and doing more like work at that time, they took the wrong advice and waited for a label to come and sign them.
I'm just waiting and waiting for it to happen.
I try not to say like, why weren't they this? Because for me, they are.
There's this thing called loss of innocence. That's what happened to Dave. It's like he was no longer just this teenager going, wow, I can do whatever I want, shoot little rubber bullets and shit, which was just incredible because he could pull it off because he believed it. And so I think that he thought he had to grow up, and he kind of grew up and lost that innocence. And part of what made the early Hoods so magical was the innocence. And you can't replace innocence. There's nothing you can do about it.
Everyone who listened to them is inspired to create, and that kind of energy lasts forever.
And if you don't make that next jump up, then it all starts to implode. And I think at that point, we were burned out. The deals didn't come through, and disillusionment happened, and we broke up.
Why do certain bands make it and some don't? I mean, they have to have the talent, obviously, but luck plays a bigger part than most people realize.
Like, it's seconds and inches with this stuff. For example, our single had been released or added to going for ads to radio stations just a few weeks later. We would have bumped into No Doubt, and we never would have gotten the ad. And I would be waiting tables.
Sometimes it's just one person telling another person about a singer or a guitar player, and then things become magical when they connect.
The idea of breaking nationally. Why did they break? Well, Maxine Sartori from BCN gave their first single a spin before they were signed. It was a tape, and that was how the legend goes.
She was a woman of great pop taste, and had the microphone and had the platform to showcase it.
Led Zeppelin 1, Appetite for Destruction, Licensed to Ill, Adele's first record. Now, if you ask me, you put the Cars' first record up against any of those, you'd be hard-pressed to not say that one is up there with any of them else.
A lot of Boston bands, when they got signed, the albums, whoever was producing it put too much of a shine on it and really took away the magic of the band. In the case of the Cars, it didn't happen. There was certainly a shine put on them, but it was not overbearing. It was just right for them. And the songs are tremendous. On that first Cars album, pretty much classic rock radio still plays all but one or two songs.
They took elements of punk and new wave and a little of the stylishness of, say, Roxy music, and put it into a mainstream concept where there were definite hooks. Their first album, it's pretty much almost a greatest hits album in terms of every song connecting. And they had a very easy radio appeal that as radio had yet to evolve and was still pretty much stuck in the old AOR model of, arena rock, if you will.
Hi, Brad. You know how cute I always thought you were.
If you play that, for anyone that grew up in the 80s, they know exactly what that is. I'm sure it's been referenced in pop culture a million times, but I'm not sure that people know that that's the Cars.
That is,
The Cars had something that connected, I think, to people even in that range. They weren't too weird. They were arch, they were ironic, a little bit of craft work in there. And there were things that I'm sure some of the mainstream audience would have not really known about or cared about, but hooks, melodies, bang.
It's great, and we still play those songs on ZLX. It still qualifies as like classic rock, which I know it's like borderline, like that would be like Talking Heads, Ramones, Clash, The Cars. It's kind of like, but it's classic rock.
Like Pearl Jam gives back to their, roots where they might have the Buzzcocks or someone, Mission to Burma, open up for them. The Cars were the first. Whenever they played Boston, they usually had a Boston band open up for them.
Yeah, and it's too bad that that they just decided to stop. I think if they had just, Door to Door, I think the last album there, it was getting a little lean, and they were kind of in a formula that was wearing thin. I think if they had just taken a little time off, taken some time off and done some things apart. I know they each did some solo work, but they could have come back and done something great.
You're shaking like tremble around, life's the same, it's all inside.
All this great music never comes out of Boston without the club scene. The Rat, the Channel, Spit, which later became Axis, TT's in Cambridge, the list goes on and on. It was a great time for rock. Bands like The Liars, Don't Give Up Now, The Neighborhood's Prettiest Girl, or The Real Kids, All Kinds of Girls. These cuts defined that garage sound. Right after that was the wildly influential Mission to Burma. The scene was kind of oriented towards the garage side of punk rock, but there was this built-in art-damaged prog weirdo vibe that was going on too, recalled Peter Prescott. And all we wanted was shit to be loud.
I had a band in high school, and we played our high school talent show, and we did a cover of That's When I Reach for My Revolver. And so, that was clearly, part of our, part of my DNA early on.
Burma, I think anything that's that good confuses you at first until you finally realize, oh my God, this is something transcendental happening here.
Coming as they do from a scene where practically all the best bands are often overlooked in their time, the key difference is they are now recognized for their true worth. Perhaps the two reasons that Mission to Burma have enjoyed a kinder fate, they left behind a recorded legacy that closely approximates the live energy of the band.
I waved the Boston flag, and people from other scenes and other places and other cities will go, oh, that's just not true, and this was going on there. But the flagship was Mission to Burma.
One night, I went to see Mission to Burma. People were coming up to me and telling me, this band is wretched.
Yeah, and I remember when I first heard Mission to Burma, I goes, no one's going to go for this band. I mean, really.
And I said that I think I'm going to sign this band. And people were saying that would be a terrible mistake.
I never saw Mission to Burma until their last show in 1983 at the Bradford Ballroom. Their very last show, I got to see them for the first time, and I was kind of like, wow.
The first thing that happened the night that I auditioned for the Moving Parts, which had Clint Conley on bass, I just opened the door, and they were playing the Ramones. And I started doing this spazzy dance as I walked into the house, and Clint came out of the kitchen doing the exact same spazzy dance. And I go, this must be my brother right here.
Full force melodies and passion and noise just all bundled together and just put into a big fireball and just shot out of cannons, And like the fire and fury, you could almost, not hear the music,
And if you hear them in retrospect, you think, well, those are good songs. They have melodies, they have choruses, they have hooks. And people didn't really pick that up about them the first time through.
But I'm not surprised that, a band like Foo Fighters would love Mission of Burma. I mean, there's a lot to love.
We were trying to claw and dig our way into a space within the newer music that would be all ours.
So I would bring in the more experimental side, and Clint would bring in the more pop side, and then we'd meet in the middle. Sometimes I'd write something more poppy, and he'd write something more experimental, and it kind of went like this. And that's what made the band both great and a problem.
I think the one thing that stood us in good stead over these years is these songs were really sturdy constructs. They're musical.
It took a while. I don't like to say this kind of thing, but apparently the world caught up to us. And they weren't there at that time. We were just too confusing.
You know, Burma developed, a very big audience for here. They would fill a channel, certainly. 1,500 people there they could do.
They had two big local hits and getting something of a national hit, Academy Fight Song, and then That's Why I Reach for My Revolver. And they had the Verses album that had a lot of attention, and they were starting to happen. And then Roger Miller, the leader, singer, guitarist, songwriter, got tinnitus and decided that for the sake of his well-being, he could not continue with the band he was in.
You know, at some point he just, had to make some calculus in his brain. All right, I'm, 30 some odd years old. Do I want to still be hearing when I'm 65? Yeah, I better stop now.
It freaked me out that I said, I want to be able to hear when I'm 50. So I was the one who stopped the band.
When we broke up, there was kind of an outpouring of appreciation from the people, which was unexpected and really very nice. So.
The irony here is that was my reasoning for stopping. I wanted to be able to hear when I was 50. Now, in 2002, when Mission of Burma reformed, I was 50. I could say, and I can hear. So I'm going to keep playing rock music. There's the irony.
In articles, they say, oh, they've influenced Nirvana and, Pearl, or Sonic Youth and all. It's like, we never said that.
Right from the moment. Here's where it all started. The history will blow you away. Right from the arts, the symphony, the ballet. There's a lot to fit in. Right from the legend.
Are you the legend? Nah, he's the legend. Hey, I'm just marvelous.
Right from the heart.
To be part of Boston's exciting new spirit, just call 1-800-858-0200.
It'll cheer you right up. Boston is right from the start.
Regardless of what Aerosmith, Boston, or the Cars were doing, the whole thing started to proliferate in a huge way by the mid-'80s. And what nobody saw coming was a couple of teenage girls from Newport, Rhode Island.
You built a city in my head, then there were candles, and a phoenix in my bed. These are subwords, these are air. There's one boy in one house in one place.
To the eternal shame of Boston, female bands were a rarity at that point. That was starting to change. First you had Lizzie Borden and the Axes, they were one of the first ones. And then Salem 66, they had a bit of a buzz in the early 80s. Throwing Muses were 3/4 female, they were from Newport, Rhode Island. The most jarring thing about them was that they were teenagers.
We didn't all move up at once. A couple of us were kind of the vanguard and came first, so that would be 85. And then by 86, we were all living here.
And they had a cassette demo that nobody had heard anything like it. The songs were so askew with the rhythms they had, the way the singers would both kind of yelp in tune, and yet it was really beautiful in a really unsettling way, and nobody had really quite heard that sound. And they really caused a storm here when they started playing. People loved them, people hated them.
I felt like the band was genderless because they were up there they were getting airplay on FNX like in regular rotation with all the other major label bands. And then Kristen got pregnant and she was like playing live. Women like that, doing stuff like that really just was like, well, this is what we do. We have babies and we play in rock bands, and that's cool.
And in a way, they also spawned this little more artsy kind of scene that was developing because their opening band at a lot of the early shows was the Pixies.
I think personally that the Pixies had a lot to do with a lot of interest happening for Boston because Rana blew up and he said, who influenced him? And he said the Pixies.
There was a guy.
got killed by 10 million pounds of sludge from New York and New Jersey.
If the industry wanted those left-of-center bands, Boston was happy to oblige. Before Black Francis dissolves the Pixies in '92, which was gut-wrenching to the entire industry, they were respected enough that U2 had them open a tour, and David Bowie covered them on 2 separate albums.
You had Lemonheads, you had Buffalo Tom, you had Letters to Cleo, who did really well, you had Blake Babies, Throwing Muses for a little while, Belly.
There was a time there where it seemed like someone was getting signed, every few months, which was not usual.
The word was out that Boston was chock full of rock stars waiting to be discovered, and after Nirvana released Nevermind, all these record labels came into Boston.
The tour dates that had been Nirvana's confirmed tour dates, once they broke, like they became huge, and overnight they went to bigger venues. And somebody said, I have the fax still at my house that says, hey, Nirvana bailed on these dates, does Buffalo Tom want them, right? So when that Nirvana thing happened, it really was sort of like BC and AD.
Okay, you say Seattle, great. Everybody thinks, what do you think? Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, what else? Name 5 more. But there's only a handful, where Boston had much more than a handful. And we had all these different types of sound that were completely different from what had come before. That awful Bosstown sound of Orpheus that they tried to champion, different from the blues sound of Giles or of Aerosmith, differ from the poppier arena-style sounds of Boston or the Cars. So we didn't need to be defined as a scene or even recognized. And we had always hoped that some of these bands would break beyond. And a few did, and they went their own way.
When Nirvana broke, it was like a rebirth of rock. Bands from Boston left and right getting million-dollar record deals. And what was left for us to do? I mean, why not open a rock club? We had our logo etched in the steps. I mean, it's self-indulgent, sure. Not as bad as some, though. There was one band I remember. You could not get in the door. I didn't care that if I was Steven Tyler. I didn't care that I owned the place. There just wasn't enough room for someone to get in when these guys played.
Ladies and gentlemen, my next guests come to us from my hometown of Boston, Mass. I call it Beantown. And they're here tonight to perform a song from their album, Mega Kung Fu Radio. Please welcome Power Man 5000.
Somebody was asking me the other day, like, how long in Boston did you have to play in front of 5 people and 10 people? And I was thinking, like, never. Like, it almost, like, overnight became a big thing here.
So we played a bunch of shows together because we were label mates, and they were just the nicest guys, great musicians. They knew how to put on a great show. I think we played together at Mamakin to bring it all full circle.
We were selling out every room in Boston. Like any club, we would sell out every night, but nobody knew about us. It wasn't until we decided to start venturing out, and we booked a show in New York at a club called Brownies.
I mean, no one was surprised that they got signed. And then, as with any band that gets signed, you hope that it brings more of a spotlight onto Boston. But then sometimes you're afraid that the more bands that get signed, that's less record deals for our town.
Because in my mind, we're still this ridiculous band that I thought if 50,000 people get it, I win, right? But then you have this thing, suddenly you're on MTV every hour, every show sold out every night. You're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm playing with bands that I used to stock their CDs at Tower Records, you know?
Even though Nirvana broke in '92, if you were to take a time machine to the Rumble that year, you would see a who's who of bands that went on to become huge acts. That just goes to show you the power of music in Boston in the early 90s. Letters to Cleo, Sam Black Church, Morphine, Power Man 5000. I mean, talk about two of the most opposite bands on the same bill, but it didn't matter, because that's how great music in Boston was.
Once again, though, I mean, like look at the apples and look at the oranges we're talking about. We're saying Power Man 5000 and Morphine in the same sentence. I mean, but with both of them being unbelievable at what they were doing.
For every rock star in Boston, like myself or Joe Perry, was the antithesis of that, which is the mysterious Mark Sandman. He didn't care about scarves on microphones like I did. He didn't care about clothing, but he was just as fucking cool as I was, maybe even cooler. This was the late mid-'80s when Aquanet was flying off the shelves. Mark remained. He kind of reminded me of like a badass version of Kramer from Seinfeld, except probably way, way fucking cooler.
I've never felt cooler listening to a band than when you listen to Morphine.
Just seemed like a badass. Like that seemed like one of those, like this feels like the soundtrack to a movie that I want to see, you know?
So we're on the Nine Lives tour. I'm with Steven and we're in the hotel lobby, and Mark Sandman was in there. Just to see him in Brussels, and then Steven was a Morphine fan, and I never knew that.
Dana's saxophone playing with the 2-string bass, those two things, and Mark's voice just resonated together in such a way that it was like nothing else you've ever heard. It created something completely magical that would connect to your heart.
You'll hear a lot about Mark Sandman because he was one of the more charismatic figures in Boston at that time.
I remember seeing Mark do his thing and thinking, wow, this guy's, incredibly charismatic, and he's playing a style of music that is really unusual for the time.
His voice is so rich. The sax is so rich. The drums are perfect, and
I remember thinking, oh, I'd love to write a song like Morphine, and then that thought went instantly out of my head, like, you can't do that.
Well, I grew up, my dad was into big band swing, so I loved horns anyways. And I always thought, like, I always felt the trumpet was just as powerful as an electric guitar. I loved that stuff. So, and then listen how they had all that low end.
He had a long list of names. I said, well, Morphine, we're guaranteed we will not be on television. We're guaranteed no commercial success with this name. Let's take it.
I booked Morphine's record release party at the Wang Center, $10,000 budget from Johnny Walker, had the posters made. So the final sign-off from the promotional department, marketing department, and Johnny Walker, they get the thing, they go, we can't sponsor a band called Morphine.
Did our set, and we came back up to the dressing room, and Sandman was like, wow, dude, that was a lot of intensity, man. Like, I sweat a lot. That's, wow.
Play a band instrument, for Christ's sake. How am I going to get laid with a band instrument?
After Cure for Pain took off, I think every single A&R person in the country was calling me.
They wanted to start having bands on their label, which was just newly created. So they were feeling it out too. And we were one of the first groups they hired, I think.
George Michael was the first artist they signed, then they signed Morphine.
We never really fully had the opportunity to experience what that would have been like. And it's the life expectancy sort of thing was not cut short.
What the problem is.
And in a way, it became this sort of shared grief among Boston for the next year, at least.
There's not many bands where when a member passed away, I was truly crushed that we didn't get more music out of them. Like, what would they have done?
I could say that a lot of things took the wind out of the sails for the Boston music scene. He was a big part of that scene, right? And helping younger bands. But there were also other things. I think radio, which had a big influence in Boston. WFNX, I think, was starting to struggle. Mark passing away, absolutely, but radio changing, journalism changing, losing zines, everything becoming more electronic, more international.
We've lost a lot. We've lost a lot. Radio had a huge part in that. And that started to shift over time. And, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about corporate radio takeover, but it definitely had an effect, a huge effect.
Radio changed dramatically with the Telecommunications Act in 1996, because then a corporation could own multiple radio stations in one market. Before that, you could only own a few radio stations. Prior to that, you could only own one. Then it expanded, and then you could own multiple radio stations. And by doing so, it really homogenized radio.
From 1968 until 1999, arguably maybe even later with the Dropkicks, maybe more than any other city, so much fucking unbelievable music came out of Boston and New England.
I don't know. I think maybe WBCN had a lot to do with it.
This is the final show at WBCN Boston. A lot of folks say, what's the last song going to be, Bradley J? Well, it's a secret. It sets the tone for the whole thing. And it says a lot of stuff that I won't have to say.
Faster miles an hour. Gonna drive faster, stop and shop with the radio on.
The dumbest, etc. Your least liked, the worst fan base in the NFL.
I say this with all due respect. It's the Patriots.
Yes!
Charlie Baker, the governor, he tweeted that Fenway fans' behavior at the Red Sox game last night was unacceptable and shameful. It's acceptable. This is not what Massachusetts and Boston are about. Yes, it is.
Nobody cares. It's tired. Just go win your game.
When did Boston become less of a city of rebellion and more a city of homogenized, let's just all get behind our sports teams and let's not think about how to change the world anymore? I don't know exactly.
This is sports town America, and it's gotten to a point where it's an embarrassment of riches. It's gotten to a point where sometimes, I'll go to the next parade. So, yes, the identity has changed.
I think the rise of sports becoming more of a religion in Boston dovetailed with the decline of everything about arts in Boston.
Just did a band practice the other night. Two of the guys in the band wanted to go upstairs and watch, the postseason, the Red Sox, and I'm like, what?
For a while, it seemed that nobody in the city cared about it either.
I don't know if everyone was in the closet about that, or if they, as soon as we started winning, then it was, but it is a strange dichotomy.
Every year I look at the list of bands that are playing the Rumble, and I don't know one of them. I might have heard of something, and the same thing when they have the Boston Music Awards. Unless David Minahan's up for Producer of the Year, I don't know anybody there. Should I? I don't know. But it's just the way things are going, I guess.
That's the great thing about music. Who the fuck knows? Who cares?
You can't really get that cynical, because we just had a festival here called Boston Calling. But the headliners, Jack White, Queens of the Stone Age, that was rock music to me. That was stuff I could relate to. I don't think good music is going away. I do think the grassroots network that spawned an awful lot of good music is going away.
So where do we go from here? I don't know. Maybe there's some kid out there with a guitar who's going to change everything. Maybe there's a little girl in Japan who's going to come out with some kind of music that nobody's ever heard before. The point is, rock will never die. It will just come in different forms.